In dense darkness, O Mother, thy formless beauty sparkles. Therefore the yogis meditate in a dark mountain cave. In the lap of boundless dark, on Mahanirvana's waves upborne, peace flows serene and inexhaustible. Taking the form of the void, in the robe of darkness wrapped, who art thou, Mother, seated alone in the shrine of Samadhi? From the lotus of thy fear-scattering feet flash thy love's lightnings. Thy spirit face shines forth with laughter terrible and loud. rashi nivido dhare ma tor chamke rup rashi tai
Om Tadekam Smaramas-tadekam Bhajamaha Tadekam Jagat Sakshi Rupam Namamaha Sadekam Nidhanam Niralambamisham Bhavam Bodhipotam Sharanyam Vrajamaha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. On that alone do we meditate, that alone do we worship, to that alone, the witness of the universe, do we bow, to that one who is our sole eternal support, the self-existent Lord, the raft to safety across the ocean of this world, do we come for refuge. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning.
Good morning.
And beautiful to see all of you. Thank you to Preeti for the song, which really expresses everything about what this talk is about. The topic today, as you might know, is Silence, O My Soul. And this song was a favorite of Sri Ramakrishna's. And it was actually composed by one of the members of the Brahmo Samaj, that modern reform movement from which many of his young disciples actually came. And Trailokanath Sanyal, he had also a pen name, Chiranjeev Sharma. And he wrote a number of songs inspired by Sri Ramakrishna, seeing Sri Ramakrishna's devotion to the Divine Mother, and seeing his continual ecstasies. He wrote a number of songs. This is one of them. And though Preeti read out the translation, I just want to think a little bit more about this beautiful song, because the melody itself takes us to a place of silence, a place of feeling like we can commune with the divine. It's so noisy in our heads. If that noise can quiet down a little, we come face to face with God. That's the idea of the song. In dense darkness, O Mother, thy formless beauty sparkles. The Brahmo Samajists were against worshiping God with form. They thought the divine should be conceived of as formless. There's a shoe stuck in the door there, and the sound is coming through. If someone could repair that, please. talk about silence. We live next to the freeway, and we constantly have that sound. So with just the door open, and you hear a little more of that, the rush of that freeway. Thank you. So in dense darkness, not only is there absence of light, there's an absence of sound. It's perfectly silent. And therefore, the yogis meditate they find a cave in the mountains somewhere. And this is, of course, the tradition of India, of the mountain monks who find a cave somewhere in a deep forest or in the mountains where it's dark, it's completely silent. And there they seek to find the infinite. And where is the infinite found? Of course, it's found deep within. But without all the external distractions, we can perhaps more easily dive within and find the mother. So this description of a direct experience of the Divine Mother is given in this song. In the lap of boundless dark, it's a wonderful translation, by the way. In the lap of boundless dark, on Mahanirvana's waves upborne, peace flows, serene and inexhaustible. That inexhaustible peace. Our peace is always temporary. We feel a little peace, so we get a little, we finish a job, right? We finish I'm finished. But then, but there's also that other thing I have to do. And pretty soon that peace evaporates. This peace is inexhaustible. It flows continuously without any end. And then the mother, taking the form of the void, in the robe of darkness wrapped. Who art thou, mother, seated alone in the shrine of Samadhi? Sri Ramakrishna, of course, was continually merging into Samadhi. So this vision of a shrine, a temple of Samadhi, and Mother is seated there, all alone. When we enter that blessed state, we behold the Mother, just she and I. When Sri Ramakrishna would hear this line, he himself would enter that state of Samadhi, when everything goes within. The mind also becomes completely attenuated, and all consciousness becomes merged in the divine. The individual consciousness becomes merged in the divine consciousness. From the lotus of thy fear-scattering feet flash thy love's lightnings. Thy spirit face shines forth with laughter, terrible and loud. So there's, in that deep silence, perhaps the Mother, who is also power, the infinite power behind this universe, the Shakti, perhaps also there is again sound, the sound of her laughter, as she watches this play unfold. So this hymn expresses something of what I'm trying to touch on, what I would like to touch on somehow in today's talk about silence. The call of silence, the call of peace, of mountain caves and deep meditation. When I chose the topic, that was, of course, last month, we have to choose the topic in advance, and I knew that I would be going to Tennessee for a retreat in the mountains for a week. And so I thought this is a good time to speak on this subject, because I will have gone to the mountains. And there is something about going to the mountains, going to the woods, and the natural beauty, the silence. There's no sound of urban life. Our minds get stilled, naturally stilled. It's a help to us. Our minds get stilled. And there's a great benefit to this place where we go for retreat. It's off the digital grid, not off the power grid. There's power and there's running water and everything, but there's no mobile signal. There's no Wi-Fi. So 30 years ago, this would not even be a question. But now, our days, our hours, our minutes are punctuated with little bells and whistles coming from our devices, telling us that someone's sending us a message, or someone's sending us an email, or someone wants to talk to us, or some breaking news has come, or somebody has posted a picture to Facebook, or constant distraction. So it makes our mind, as it said, bahirmukha, going out, facing outwards. This is the natural way our senses go, they go out. But if we want to find the divine, yes, we can search to every corner of the world. We know that we have to turn our gaze within. And surprisingly, perhaps, going into nature, going to seeing the beauty of the external nature, the mind becomes stilled, and actually it's a very good place to then look within. There's some theories about why it's so. I think really why our minds become so easily calmed in nature is twofold. One, it's generally a manifestation of sattva. It's sattvic beauty. All our senses are engaged in this kind of sattvic means peace-giving beauty. And there's a lot of prana. There's so much plant life and animal life, and we don't have a lot of concrete and buildings. So that's one reason. And I think we get a glimpse of the divine peeking through all of that, in that beauty of a mountain or a stream in a forest. We start to feel that what the sages tell us is true, that the divine is shining in everything and is peeping at us. As Sister Nivedita put it, the Divine Mother is peeping at us every moment in so many ways, but we have to catch her peeping. And it's perhaps easier to catch her peeping when we're in a forest glade with a little brook running by and the birds are chirping, and suddenly we feel that Mother is talking to us through the birds. And in solitude, if we can go find some time in solitude in nature, we start to remember who we are. Spiritual life, we have a community, and the support of community is very important. But ultimately, our spiritual realization, it's me and the divine. It's the flight of the alone to the alone, said one of the great mystics, Plotinus. That's what our spiritual life is. And that's one of the specialities of yoga and Vedanta, this recognition or this approach to the divine. Not that the specialty of Islam, you could say, is the group approach to the divine, all worshiping together, shoulder to shoulder. Muslims will stand in the mosque, standing shoulders touching and worshiping together. Whereas in Vedanta, we say, well, it is I and God. By the by, it occurred to me that it's actually kind of ridiculous to give a talk on silence because I'm saying a lot of words when the topic is silence. And there is a verse from Shankaracharya in his Dakshinamurti Stotram. At the end, there's some extra verses describing the guru. Dakshinamurti is a young guru seated under a tree. And he's got disciples around him, and the disciples are all old. And they have their doubts, and he's teaching them. But how is he teaching them? Not with words, just with silence. His way of teaching is in silence, and all the doubts of the disciples are dispelled. So if we had with us a teacher like that, then we wouldn't need to have these talks and all the struggles we have. But the verse goes like this: Chitram vatataror mule vridha shishya gurur yuva gurostu maunam yakyanam shishyastu chinna samshaya. And the verse says, actually it's strange. Look at this, what an amazing sight. There's a young guru sitting under the tree, and the old disciples are sitting around. And though he's not saying a word, maunam vyakyanam, maunam, that silence, he's teaching with silence, the disciples' doubts are dispelled. So this is, in silence, we actually can receive the teachings of a great soul like Ramakrishna or Vivekananda. Or even perhaps we have met someone like that. We can influence each other just by the force of our own peace and quiet, our own pure mind, our own deep love. Yes, people feel that. It's not that we have to talk all the time. Sri Ramakrishna used to insist that sincere seekers of the divine need to retire sometimes, to get away from everything and go on retreat. He called it going into solitude. He'd say, if you can go away from your family for 3 days, it will be very helpful. Even for 1 day, it's very helpful. He would say, people shed a whole jug of tears for husband or wife or children, but who weeps for God? The thing is, we don't long for God. When we go into solitude and we're not around our families, we have no duties, it's just there we are, faced with ourselves. We can start to remember that there's more to life than our families, more to life than our jobs, more to life than all the little plans we have for next month and next year. There's a deep principle which we need and without which we cannot live, which we need to find, which we need to touch in solitude and silence. We seek for that. He would liken it to when you plant a tree. When it's a sapling, you have to put a fence around it so that the cows and goats don't eat it. Once it's strong, you can tie an elephant to it. So likewise, in the beginning of spiritual life, it's very helpful to go into solitude. It's like putting the fence around. And we see the great souls like Swami Vivekananda. He was constantly yearning to go to a cave in the Himalayas, and now and then he would get a chance to go and retire for a few days all alone, and he would come back radiant, recharged. So we can think about adding that to our spiritual practice, taking some time. Even in a daily matter, we have, of course, our practice here of everyday morning meditation in the temple, silent. Without fail, we touch that silence. We need that silence. Our minds are so noisy. We fail to realize how noisy they are because there's so much external noise. When we cut down the external noise, then we begin to hear all the internal noise. And we can work on letting it go, calming it down. So we need that daily silence. We need that daily solitude in meditation. Perhaps a walk. Even though we're in an urban setting, we do have trees, we have gardens, we have... get out of the house and breathe the air and feel the presence of the divine around us. Touch that peace, that silence, which is actually our true nature. So the topic, silence, O my soul, actually I think I kind of misremembered a quote from Swami Vivekananda. And Swami Vivekananda himself was quoting Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. When Swamiji was a wandering monk, for some time he had 2 books with him, the Bhagavad Gita and also The Imitation of Christ, which is a beautiful manual for monastic life, as well as for people who are really sincere seekers of God. And this is the line that he remembered years later. He didn't. The line that would come back to him as epitomizing the whole book was this one: Silence, ye teachers of the world, and silence, ye prophets. Speak thou alone, O Lord, unto my soul. In another place he puts it this way: silence, ye teachers of the world, silence, ye books. Lord, thou alone speak, and thy servant listeneth. It's interesting. Swamiji himself, this line comes in the Imitation, but it's a little different in the Imitation. Maybe Swamiji also remembered it a little differently. You are all that I want and desire. Let all teachers be mute, and all creation keep silence before you. Speak to me, you and you alone. Beautiful. This idea that let me, God, Lord, speak to me, thou and thou alone. I don't need to hear what all the teachers say. I don't need to read what all the books say. I need to hear the Lord. That's enough. Swami Prabhupada, the head of the Vedanta Society, former head who's left the body since then, he used to, I went for a retreat at the Olima Center just north of San Francisco, and I asked him for a little guidance. What should I do on this retreat? And he had only one small sentence for me. He said, just you and God. When you go on this retreat, just you and God. Forget your job, forget your place of residence, forget all your everything else. Just you and God. I'd like to read a little more from the Imitation. The author of the Imitation asks, why are we so fond of speaking and conversing with one another, though we rarely return to our silence without some injury to our consciences? The reason why we enjoy talking is because we seek solace in chatting with one another and desire to lighten our distracted hearts. Furthermore, we enjoy talking about and thinking about the things we most want and desire, or those which we especially dislike. But alas, it is often vain and to no purpose, for the consolation gained by talking greatly diminishes the internal consolation granted us by God. Now, we're not keeping silence like the monks of those days used to keep silence most of the day, and then they'd go and they'd maybe have a little conversation, and it would throw them off. Their whole meditation would be spoiled because they talked a little bit about. But it has a real nugget of truth here. What do we mostly talk about when we talk? Other people, the gossip, the latest news, the politics. How often do we get together and talk about God, about meditation, about what the saints do, or how to the latest prayer that we learned, or a beautiful song that we heard, a spiritual hymn. And why do we do that? It gives some kind of excitement, some kind of titillation. It distracts us from our troubles, and yet it doesn't bring us closer to God. It doesn't bring us closer to that silence. We have forgotten how to really listen, how to listen deep within. Listening perhaps for the voice of God. Perhaps we can listen for the voice of the Mother. There's this, from the Bible, the voice of God is described as the still, small voice. Maybe we think of God, when God talks, it'll be like thunder and lightning, right? God speaks to me, and the bush is burning, and the lightning is blitzing, and the thunder is thundering, and the earth is quaking. But there's one passage where Elijah goes, and he's going to receive the message of the Lord, and he doesn't find God in any of those things, in the earthquake, in the fire, in the wind, in the lightning. He hears he finally hears a still, small voice, very subtle. That's the voice of God. we have to become a little quiet if we want to hear it. Perhaps we have to become very quiet. Sri Ramakrishna used to say that in the course of our spiritual practice, we develop a love body. And that love body has love ears and love eyes. And it is with the ears of love that we hear the voice of God. It is with the eyes of love that we see the form of God. The other problem with my topic, Silence, O My Soul, is that actually silence is the very nature of my soul, of the soul. Our soul is one with the infinite consciousness. Brahman, the absolute, and Atman, my self, my true self, are one and of the nature of infinite peace, infinite silence, infinite fullness, infinite consciousness. So it's actually our mind which needs to become silent, not the soul. Our soul is already established in silence. We only need to find it. We only need to hear that silence. If we have the ears to hear, we use our ears to hear talking, we use our ears to hear music. What about using our ears to hear silence? The very nature of the divine is silence. There was a sage who was asked by a king. The king approached the sage and wanted to know what is the nature of Brahman. And he kept asking and asking and asking. And finally the sage told him, "But I'm telling you. I'm already telling you. His name is silence." His very nature is silence. So Sri Ramakrishna would tell the story of a father who sent his two sons to get taught by a guru. And so they stayed with the guru for several years, and they learned all the scriptures, and they learned about Brahman, about the truth of who they are, the truth of what the essence of reality. And they came back to their father, and the father asked them, he's going to give them a little quiz. So tell me about Brahman. And so the older son, he started quoting from the scriptures, quoting the various descriptions of Brahman. And the father nodded, all right. And then he asked the younger son. And the younger son merely stood quietly with his eyes down. He didn't say anything. And the father was pleased. He said, "My child, you have understood a little of Brahman. What it is cannot be expressed in words." Sri Krishna says that his very nature is silence. In 10th chapter of the Gita, he's describing all the manifestations of the divine as we see in this world, and one of them is, of all the secrets, I am silence. Maunam jayavasmi guhyanam. Of secrets, I am verily silence. So it's the very nature of the divine, the very nature of our own soul. And it's also a spiritual discipline, which we term also as maunam, restraint of speech, restraining ourselves from speaking so much. And in fact, the term silence in Yoga Vedanta, we find it generally comes back to this idea of speech, of quieting speech, not so much that of the silence of, say, the wind shouldn't be blowing or the birds shouldn't be chirping. Though that's not the silence that's generally referred to. It's the silence of the words have become stilled. The mind has become stilled. And those who practice maunam, this restraint of speech, become the munis, the seers. And it's very interesting to note how Sri Krishna describes in the Gita this practice of maunam, because he gives the threefold tapas, the threefold spiritual disciplines which are generating heat, which are to help us break through the veil of ignorance which prevents us from attaining our own empire, as it were. And they're the disciplines of body, the disciplines of speech, and the disciplines of mind. And there are various disciplines. The disciplines of body include a worship, and disciplines of speech include recitation of scriptures, and also the speech must be beneficial, it must not be harmful, it must be truthful, all these things. But the discipline of monam, the discipline of restraint of speech, of silence, is not part of the tapas of speech. It's part of the tapas of mind. It's actually a spiritual discipline of the mind to restrain the speech, to silence the speech, to restrain that constant urge to express. For some people, silence may actually be oppressive. And perhaps sometimes for us, we come home and the house is empty, the apartment's empty, there's nobody there, it's quiet, and it feels oppressive. We're like, we immediately turn on the radio or put on some music, and why is that? And then at other times, we find silence, and it's deeply refreshing and deeply inspiring even. I think it's the difference between tamas and sattva. As Swami Vivekananda often points out, the extremes look alike, but they're not, they're very different. The principle of tamas is the principle of inertia, of darkness. Yes, it might also be a silence, a quiet, but a quiet that's dark, that's empty, that's dragging us down, the quiet of falling asleep. Whereas the silence of sattva is that silence of perfect harmony and balance, which is a silence of fullness, a silence of infinite possibilities. So this is, we see how people are afraid of silence. How many people, when you get into your car, the first thing you do is you start the engine and the radio's already going to your favorite station, or you've got your favorite song hooked up now. I guess you use your phones to do it. Most people I've seen, when driving, music has to be there. How about driving and repeating the name of the divine in silence? It's another way. It's a possibility. I know people who don't turn on the radio when they get in the car. It's possible to do it. Another example is the dining table. You know, in our monastery, sometimes we'll be sitting at the table and no one will have anything to say, and so we'll sit in silence. And sometimes we get visitors who feel uncomfortable with that, like nobody's saying anything. We have to speak just because silence is uncomfortable. But actually, there's doesn't have to be anything uncomfortable with silence. In silence, we can enjoy being together without having the need to speak with each other. So we're eating sometimes in silence, and then other times we might be talking a lot. But there's nothing wrong with eating in silence. So Swami Vivekananda gives us a beautiful way of envisioning our mind and the whole project of yoga, of meditation, of stilling the mind. And he says, think of the mind as a lake. This is in his Raja Yoga. It's very helpful. He says, the bottom of a lake we cannot see because its surface is covered with ripples. The water is rippled, so we can't see down to the bottom. It is only possible for us to catch a glimpse of the bottom when the ripples have subsided and the water is calm. If the water is muddy or is agitated all the time, the bottom will not be seen. If it is clear and there are no waves, we shall see the bottom. The bottom of the lake, he says, this is beautiful, it's clear, right? We can't see, if you've ever been to pond or a lake on a completely calm day when the surface of the water is like glass. If you look down and the water is clear, you can see straight down to the bottom, maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe 20 feet. Directly, you can see right down. So Swami Vivekananda suggests the bottom of the lake is our own true self. And what is the water? What is the water of the lake? It's the chitta, that is our mind stuff, the stuff of our mind in which all the thoughts arise. And what are the waves? The vrittis, all the thoughts, all the activity, all the waves in our mind. So we cannot, then the analogy is clear. We cannot see our own true self. We do not realize who we are. Why? Because the water of the mind is disturbed. If that water can be made perfectly calm and placid and silent, then our true self stands revealed to us. And then he points out also these gunas, the sattva, rajas, and tamas, which we've been touching on. Again, he says the mind is in three states, one of which is darkness, called tamas, found in brutes and idiots, and people like me sometimes. All of us. It's there in all of us from time to time. It only acts to injure. No other idea comes into that state of mind. Then there's the active state of mind, rajas. That's always the antidote for this tamas, for this darkness, for this indolence. The chief motives of rajas are power and enjoyment. I will be powerful and rule others. Then there's the state called sattva. We're still reading Swamiji here. Serenity, calmness, in which the waves cease and the water of the mind lake becomes clear. Now here's what's interesting. He says, it is not inactive. The state of tamas is inactivity. The state of sattva, the waves are not arising in the mind stuff, and the mind is perfectly clear and calm, but it is not inactive, rather intensely active. Intensely active. It is the greatest manifestation of power to be calm. It is easy to be active, he points out. Yes, it's easy to be active, to restrain all that power which wants to go out and manifest as activity and thought and talking. Let the reins go and the horses will run away with you. Anyone can do that. But he who can stop the plunging horses is the strong person. Which requires the greater strength? Letting go or restraining, he asks. We have some horses, and we can just let them go, and they'll take the chariot pell-mell down the hill and maybe end up in a crash at the bottom. Or restraining. It takes great strength, perhaps, to restrain those horses, the horses of our senses, our body, and our mind, all that. And yet, if it's perfectly restrained, it's a state of intense calmness. Yet it's intense activity where everything is possible. The calm person is not the person who is dull. You must not mistake sattva for dullness or laziness. The calm person is the one who has control over the mind waves. Activity is the manifestation of inferior strength, calmness of the superior. So this is a beautiful way of understanding that this silence is not a state of dullness. It's a state of intense activity. It's a state of, it's almost paradoxical. On the one hand, it's activity, and yet it's silent and perfectly calm. So it's a state to which we aspire, and sometimes it may be helpful also to practice restraining our organ of speech. People even take a vow. There's monks who don't speak at all in both the Christian and the Hindu traditions. The monks who might have a little chalkboard to do a little bit of communication. Otherwise, no speaking at all. Swami Prabhupada, though, he tells a very funny story of a monk, one of our monks in our order, who visited his center where he was visiting, and he shared a room with him for some days. And this monk was strictly observing a vow of silence. He was not speaking with anyone. If he had to, at most, he might write something on a little slip of paper. Otherwise, he was practicing very strict silence and not talking at all. But he told us that at night, they were sharing a room, and at night, in his sleep, he was constantly talking, talking and talking in his dreams, in his sleep. And so in the morning, the Swami told him, "Hey, brother, you know you're practicing silence during the day, but at night you're constantly talking." And he wouldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that he was talking at night because he was so sincere. But so that it takes a long time to be ready for that kind of state of really not talking, because it's not about physically restraining the organ of speech. It's about a much deeper restraining the anxiety to be heard, as Thomas Merton puts it. Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk, quite well known. He was a brilliant writer, and one of his books is called Thoughts in Solitude. He spent some time as a hermit. He was in a Trappist monastery where they observed strict silence. They didn't talk at all. They've now found that it's not wise to do that, and they've have certain hours of strict silence and certain hours when the monks may talk. And in fact, the monks, though they weren't talking with their lips, they had developed their own elaborate sign language. So they would communicate with each other with sign language because talking was forbidden. So now they're allowed to talk some of the time. But he points out, it is not speaking that breaks our silence, but the anxiety to be heard. It always struck me. We can speak and not break silence. It's this anxiety to be heard. I have to be heard. I have to speak. I have to tell all these things. Let me read a beautiful passage from his Thoughts in Solitude, this thoughts that he wrote down while he was in solitude and silence. When I am liberated by silence, when I am no longer involved in the measurement of life, but in the living of it, I can discover a form of prayer in which there is effectively no distraction. My whole life becomes a prayer. My whole silence is full of prayer. Let me seek then the gift of silence and poverty and solitude, where everything I touch is turned into prayer, where the sky is my prayer, the birds are my prayer, the wind in the trees is my prayer, for God is all in all. How beautiful. Can you imagine if, as we spend some time in silence and the mind begins to quiet down and we begin to hear the wind as prayer, and we see that the sky is prayer, and the birds chirping are prayer, and everything we touch becomes prayer. As we see the divine shining through everything, as we see the mother peeping through everything, everything becomes prayer in this silence. Another way of conceiving of this silence is there's two ways of understanding silence: silence as an absence, or silence as a fullness. And I think that harkens back to our discussion of the tamas versus sattva. Silence as being no thought of anything, but there's also a silence that can be a complete thought of one thing. And if we make that one thing God, then it's in a complete fullness. When the sky becomes prayer, and the birds become prayer, and the sun everything becomes prayer. And a great help for that is the mantra. For those of us who have been initiated, or if we aren't initiated but we have selected for ourselves a mantra, repeating a mantra in solitude, it becomes it starts to become the only thought. It starts to become the only sound we hear, and it is very much akin to the sound of silence. And in fact, the mantra also contains silence. The mantra is, as it were, cradled in silence. The universal mantra, the first mantra, is Om. And Om is said to have 4 quarters. The akara, the ukara, the second letter, u, the makara, the M sound at the end, and then the 4th is silence. That's part of the mantra, is this silence. And Sri Ramakrishna used to say that the Om merges into silence. He would say that, of course, in those days, the people who were sincere seekers, oftentimes they would have a certain ritual they did 3 times a day. Particularly in the Brahmin families, they would have this, what they call the Sandhya Vandana. It was quite a complex series of prayers and chants and meditations and all that. And part of that was the prayer, the Gayatri prayer, which is a short, powerful prayer for spiritual illumination. And so he would say the Sandhya, this complex of rituals and prayers, merges in the Gayatri. And the Gayatri merges in Om. Gayatri begins and ends in Om. So the whole prayer of the Gayatri merges into, and then it just becomes Om. And Om in Samadhi. Om culminates in Samadhi, and which is another name for silence, when the individual soul has merged in the super soul. It is like the sound of a bell, says Sri Ramakrishna. The yogi, by following in the trail of the sound Om, gradually merges himself or herself in the Supreme Brahman. Well, I'd like to close the topic today by reading a few passages from Swami Vivekananda, from his letters. This letter is written to Mary Hale, his American sister, with whom he shared so much of, on the one hand, simple brotherly love and chit-chat, and on the other, revelations of his own spiritual understanding, revelations of his own spiritual condition. And he was writing to her, and he writes, "Things are not humming for you just now. I am so sorry. That is, I am trying to be, for I cannot be sorry for anything anymore." Interesting. On the one hand, he loves Mary very much. They're like brother and sister, so I'm sorry. But then he realizes that actually he's gone beyond that. I'm trying to be, for I cannot be sorry for anything anymore. I am attaining peace that passeth understanding, which is neither joy nor sorrow, but something above them both. Now I am nearing that peace, the eternal silence. So he's giving a profound hint to the states to which he, I think, often touched and where he often dwelt. But then he would come down to this world and worked incredibly hard to put in a lever for the good of humanity, as it were, as he said, impelled by the power of the Divine Mother, by the command of the Divine Mother. But then he would come to this point where he cannot be sorry anymore because he is nearing that peace, the eternal silence. Now I mean to see things as they are, everything in that peace, perfect in its way. He goes on, this is the great lesson that we are here to learn through myriads of births and heavens and hells, that there is nothing to be asked for, desired for, beyond one's self, capital S. This is the lesson nothing to be asked for, nothing to be sought for, nothing to be desired, except our own true self, which is the peace that passeth understanding, which is infinite love, which is perfection. The greatest thing I can obtain is myself. I am free, therefore I require none else for my happiness. Alone through eternity, because I was free, am free, and will remain free forever. This is Vedantism. I preached the theory so long, but oh joy, Mary, my dear sister, I am realizing it now every day. Yes, I am. I am free, alone, alone. I am the one without a second. So it's interesting because we understand that Swamiji was an illumined soul all the time. But it seems that in the midst of work, perhaps that constant awareness would dim slightly. And then towards the end of his life, it became ever stronger and stronger, as we see reflected in this letter. One more short excerpt from his famous letter to Josephine MacLeod, which was written, this was written in 28th March, 1900. 21 days later, 18th April 1900, he wrote, "Oh, it is so calm. My thoughts seem to come from a great, great distance in the interior of my own heart. They seem like faint, distant whispers, and peace is upon everything. Sweet, sweet peace. Like that one feels for a few moments just before falling into sleep, when things are seen and felt like shadows, without fear, without love, without emotion. Peace that one feels alone, surrounded with statues and pictures. I come, Lord, I come." In that state of calmness, one's own thoughts seem to come from a great distance. We are far beyond the mind, far beyond the thoughts. The thoughts may be arising from a great distance, and nothing can disturb that calm. And what is the one call? What is the one need? What is the one desire? I come, Lord, I come. I think that's enough for today. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was lovely. From that text is from the Psalms, isn't it? From the Bible, the Psalms. Be still and know that I am God. Varapranas, just repeated the same line, repeated again and again, is beautiful. Next week, our speaker will be Swami Sarvadevananda, and his topic is the Achina tree, the tree that nobody knows, the unknown tree, or the unrecognizable tree. And we have our regular classes continuing Tuesday through Thursday nights, and also Tuesday afternoons. Any other announcements you can think of? So Krishna Puja coming up in San Diego around the 24th of August, but we're not sure yet if it's going to be in person or online only. If it's online only, then of course it's easy to join. If it's going to be in person, then it's a wonderful experience. So it depends a little on the latest. Do we have time for a questions and comments? If anyone has a burning question or comment, I can take one or two. Pretty, could you give the microphone?
Hi, Swami. Oh, is this working?
Just a second.
Yep.
It will be shortly.
Okay. Hello? Here we go. Hi, Swami. My name is Thais, and my question was, last Tuesday, I was hanging out with someone that went to, I don't remember if it was a 3-month or a 3-week silence retreat, and it kind of felt like, all the words that he hadn't been spoken were like coming out now that he was no longer doing the retreat. And like he just like couldn't stop talking. And I don't say this to be like, oh, that dude sucks, like he's fine. I just feel like I've experienced this in my own practice, where sometimes if I intensified like God-seeking activities, then, if I have to go back out into the world kind of comes back twofold, you know what I mean? So my question was, do you have any like suggestions or techniques to kind of like manage this bounce back, you know what I mean? If that makes sense.
Right, that's a great question, Thais. And we do understand that as we, that's why generally we want to follow what's called the middle path. And Buddha gave the example of a veena and the strings on the veena. If the strings are too loose, you don't get any sound. Or take a guitar. If the strings are too loose, you don't get a sound. If the strings are too tight, they snap. And likewise, on the one, it's true, it's a balance, because on the one hand, we do want, if we're real seekers, we want to do intense spiritual disciplines. Yet we have to be careful not to overdo it. And especially in the beginning of spiritual life, earlier stages, we can get reactions. A good example I can give from my own life, and it was here, I had come here, it was long before I became a monk, not long before, means a few years before, and I had a really good meditation. I felt really peaceful, I felt so joyful. And I got into my car and I drove back to my apartment on the freeway, and somebody cut me off on the freeway. And immediately, I was consumed with rage. I was so angry, and I floored the accelerator to catch up with them and, do something. And then somehow I managed to catch myself and think, wait, what am I doing? What's going on? I had such a good meditation. Why am I now so angry? How could this be? So obviously, something's wrong if your meditation makes you that angry. And one senior monk told me what probably what happened is, in the meditation, you get a taste of peace, which maybe you haven't tasted much in your whole life. You never tasted that kind of peace that we get in spiritual practice. We start tasting a higher peace, a higher joy, but it's still fleeting. And then something disturbs it. And in this case, it was driving on the freeway, and that peace which I started to taste was disturbed. It was taken away. And that created this reaction of anger, that, oh, that peace that I just had and I tasted it, it was so beautiful. Now it's been, so that kind of reaction come. So I think it's partly just go forward. These reactions will come. But to be gentle with ourselves, recognize that these are reactions to spiritual practice. As we do spiritual practice, we are, as Holy Mother put it, unwinding the spool. We've wrapped thread around a spool of all kinds of different things, all the good things we've done, all the bad things we've done, all the positive and negative are wrapped up there. And as we go on doing spiritual practice, we're unspooling it. We're becoming free. But so reactions will come, absolutely. If you're interested, there's a wonderful book called Meditation and Spiritual Life by Swami Yatishwarananda, in which he discusses at some length this issue of reactions to spiritual practice.
Any other question or comments? So there are some online questions if you want to take.
You want to read it to me?
Sure.
One or two? I see one from Neti Neti. Please answer my question about it, but I don't see a question.
Yeah, I see it.
I used to sit for meditation for hours and I gained an ability. I didn't ask for it, that I was able to hear people's thoughts. I was very scared that I stopped my deep meditation practice, and thank goodness that ability is gone. Well, yes, Swami Vivekananda, this happened to Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Ramakrishna told him, you stop your meditation for a few days. But he didn't say stop it forever. So you can take it up again. True, that would be a very disturbing result. Perhaps your meditation needs to be, probably it sounds like you need the guidance of a teacher, if you have got one, and focus your meditation on the divine, not just on silence or something like that. And that's what I would suggest for Neti Neti. Probably that's enough. I really appreciate all of you coming to share in my exploration of silence and peace. And I'll close with a chant. Om Madhuvatartayate madhuksharanti sindhavaha madhvirnasantoshadhihi madhunaktamutoshasi madhumatparthivagam rajaha madhudyaurastu nafpita madhumano vanaspatir madhumagam astu suryaha madhvirgavo bhavantu naha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Sweet blow the winds, and the very oceans give forth blessedness. May the herbs and plants bring us health and happiness. Sweet unto us be the nights and dawns. May every particle of Mother Earth be charged with blessing, and may the heavens shower us with benediction. Sweet unto us be the noble forest trees. Sweet unto us be the radiant sun. Sweet unto us be all living creation. Om, peace, peace, peace.